Heat failed in St. Anne from the outer wards first. A man could track the city's health by the order of those losses. Nursery glass cooled. Hydro trays lost their warm mist. Laundry tanks fell below comfort. Then came corridor heaters, chapel lamps, and the public baths. Once the baths went dark, people started watching one another with the mean little patience that came from cold skin and bad sleep. I was inside Exchange 12 when the latest ration cut came through. My left arm was buried to the shoulder in the belly of a thermal exchanger, while my right hand worked a torque key by feel. Water rushed through the housing with the whole district's hope in it. Each kick of the flow regulator sent a shiver through the casing into my cheek. Old weld, thin margin. A city still alive because men like me kept patching bad decisions long after they should have died. "Daniel," came over the service handset. "You still breathing in there?" "Enough for both of us." Marlon Reeves laughed somewhere beyond the panel and rapped the housing twice. "Director wants the dock team in 20. Drill run moved up." I worked the last bolt free, backed out of the exchanger, and slid onto the service grate with my coveralls wet to the chest. My wrists ached. My knees sang. 18 years in lower systems had marked every one of them on me. Marlon crouched by the open panel with a slate tucked under one arm. Broad man, shaved head, scar across the chin, patience worn thin by long service and too many supervisors. "You hear me?"
"I heard you."
"You going?" I asked for it. His mouth flattened. "You ask for all the wrong jobs. Wrong jobs keep the lights on." That line worked better when the lights stayed on. He handed me the slate. The seal at the top glowed red. St. Anne Energy Directorate, emergency deep thermal access, crew call, final clearance. The drill run had sat in argument for months. Output had dropped every quarter for 6 years. The thermal veins under the trench floor were cooling, thinning, or slipping deeper than our intake shafts could follow. Half the city called it a bad cycle. The other half called it judgment. Either way, reserve banks kept shrinking. Every speech in Civic Hall bent around the same fact. St. Anne needed a new heat source, or it would start choosing which districts deserved winter and which got the dark. I signed with my thumb. Marlon folded his arms. "Sister Ruth prayed over the shaft this morning. She prays over everything." This one sounded different. "That's because everyone listens harder when power gets short." He glanced toward the corridor and lowered his voice. "Old rule says nobody cuts below foundation grade. Old rule says a lot of things. Old rule also says the sea took the world for its sins. My grandmother said the founders buried that rule for a reason. Your grandmother also said a child with a fever needed copper wire around his ankle. That worked once. It worked because the fever broke." He let that sit, then gave me a look that said what men in St. Anne rarely said aloud. "Come back." I sealed the panel, slung on my belt, and left the exchange. The corridors were full of evening traffic, everyone wrapped in coats a little heavier than last year's. St. Anne had been built for endurance, not grace. Pressure ribs arched overhead in blunt curves of alloy and sealed stone. Pipes ran along the ceiling in bundled trunks. Chapel icons sat in niches between conduit plates, their brass faces gone green with age. Every wall carried repairs older than I was. Every repair carried some other man's hand. Sam waited outside our unit with his school tablet tucked under one arm and a schematic stylus behind his ear. 17. Too tall for the doorway. His mother's eyes, my mouth. He had my habit of standing like he was bracing for impact from a direction nobody else had noticed. "You took extra shift again," he said. "I took the job that came. You missed my systems exam." I stepped inside, peeled off my gloves and checked the wall gauge. Heat low, water ration still active. The kettle sat dry beside the sink. On the table lay Sam's notes, thermal lag calculations, exchanger diagrams, 3 corrections in red where some teacher had tried to find fault and mostly failed. "How'd you do?" Topping class. Good. His face closed. That all? I looked up. He stood in the middle of the room with that stillness he had as a child when he wanted something more than praise and had no idea how to ask for it. I tried again. Show me the lag problem. That surprised him enough to cut the edge from his mouth. He held out the tablet. Secondary jacket bleed. Everyone else routed straight through the damaged tree and lost pressure. I read it and nodded. You vented through service line 2, because 3 would have iced under reduced flow. That's right. He waited another second, then some of the hunger in him eased. Not all, never all. Director Heller already cut apprentice intake for another quarter, he said. Doesn't matter if I top the class. You'll get in. Into what? Hull maintenance? Pump scraping? Same life you got? My life kept you fed. His gaze slid to the mission slate clipped to my belt. You're diving. Yes. He went to the window and set his thumb against the thick glass. Beyond it, the city fell away in terraces of lit domes and tower spines, all clinging to the trench wall in a stack that looked sturdy from a distance and exhausted up close. Far beyond the last lamp, black water pressed against the glass with its endless weight. Every time you say yes to one of these jobs, he said, you act like St. Anne belongs to you. It belongs to all of us. It belongs to the people who keep us cold and tell us to kneel. That came from school, from his friends, from growing up in a place where every door had a rule and every rule had a hymn wrapped around it. But it came from something truer too. He was old enough now to see the city asking for sacrifice, and too young to believe sacrifice ever stopped once it started. I crossed to him and put a hand on his shoulder. This run works, power comes back, apprentices open, hydro gets full heat. You stop sleeping in a coat. He turned enough to look at me. You really believe that? I wanted to say yes. What came out was, I believe it gives us one more winter. His expression changed, not softer, just more adult. That's not the same thing. No, I said, it isn't. Silence sat between us. Then he said, quieter, I don't want your job. Good. That caught him. I want you better than me, I said. I just need the city to last long enough for it. The fight in him changed shape. Not gone, redirected. Grandad said work changes things, he murmured. He did. He died under a service tunnel. Your grandfather died on shift doing what the city needed. He died because the city always needs one more man. That one landed where truth usually does, too deep for argument. I squeezed his shoulder once and let him go. Lock the unit when chapel bell sounds. Stay out of lower access. Water line in this block still jumps. He gave me a hard nod. We understood each other best through instructions. At the door I stopped, turned back, and held up his tablet. Service line 2 was the right answer. For 1 second he looked 16 instead of 17. Then I left. At the dive dock, 20 men and 4 women moved through pre-launch checks under white work lamps. The drill rig hung in its cradle like a steel insect built for the trench floor, its bore head wrapped in sensor lines and heat shielding. Supply sleds sat in a row nearby. Suit techs passed pressure wands over seam locks and helmet rings. Every sound had purpose. Clamps striking home, pumps cycling warm, slate boards clicking hand to hand. Dr. Rosalind Bohr stood by the drill controls with her hair pinned tight under a cap and a sample case tucked against her hip. Station grey, clean lines, no insignia beyond research authority. She had the kind of face that looked carved for concentration. She wasted nothing on comfort unless comfort served the work. You're late, she said as I came up. I was under an exchanger. You spend your life under failed equipment and still walk toward more of it. That's because people like you keep drawing up better ways to break the city. Her mouth twitched. With Rosalind, that counted as warmth. Breakthrough, Daniel. That word is breakthrough. Breakthrough sounds good on a slate. Tonight it sounds better under full heat. She passed me a wafer strip, mission map, bore path, thermal estimates, Pressure deltas. Her finger tapped the lower section. 7 meters of hardened trench cap. Past that, the data opens. Old founder scans suggest a deep vent or chamber. If it's stable, St. Anne buys decades. Founder scans, I said. The same founders who wrapped half the lower city in warnings. The same founders who kept us alive under 8,000 feet of water. Director Grant Heller entered the dock with Wade Burns at his shoulder. Heller wore a dark civic coat and gloves too clean for dock work, but there was nothing soft about his face that night. He looked like a man who had not slept and had forced himself to become more precise because of it. Burns, his security chief, carried the heavy frame of a battering ram and the eyes of a man who preferred force because it cut down on discussion. Heller stepped onto the prep deck and let his gaze pass over the crew. "You all know the public version," he said. "Here is the private one. Outer Ward 3 loses heat completely in 11 days. Hydro yield falls below survivable ration in 6 weeks. If we evacuate the outer tiers, we lose 32% labor capacity and half our nursery beds. We are already choosing which pipes stay warm enough not to burst. We are already choosing which children cough through the night." That quieted the dock more effectively than any slogan. "This mission does not solve everything," he went on. "It gives us time. Time is what every city buys with its dead. I would rather buy ours with risk instead." Nobody applauded. Men shifted their weight and kept working. But more of them were listening now. Sister Ruth Carver waited near the launch gate, small and straight in her dark habit with St. Anne's silver emblem at her throat. Most people knew her as the archivist of the old religious order, or as the woman who seemed to appear whenever a pressure door failed, or a family needed names read over a body bag. I had seen her in machine rooms more than once, blessing dead men and valve banks with the same grave care. She raised a hand. "Founding mercy, keep the walls above you sound, the stone beneath you still, and the water around you blind to your passing." That was the formal blessing. Then her eyes settled on the drill head, and her next words came slower. "Honor the marked depth. Some boundaries protect more than fear." A few crewmen crossed themselves. Marlon glanced at me. Rosalind's stare sharpened with annoyance. Heller gave the dock cameras a practiced half-smile. "And with God's favor, sister, we'll bring back heat." Ruth did not smile back. "Bring back wisdom, Director. Heat follows from that." We launched 2 minutes later. I rode the second sled behind the drill rig, tether clipped to the hull bracket, helmet lamps angled forward. St. Anne fell behind us in tiers of amber domes and running service lights. The city always looked beautiful from outside. A cathedral of bubbles pinned to black stone. 5 centuries of stubborn breath in a world that had drowned everything else. Below the last habitat ring, the trench floor opened in broken shelves and ridges where old survey crews had sunk anchors and left them. The shaft marker stood where the first founder team had cut a shallow thermal well generations ago and capped it with blessing plates and sealed warnings. We had stripped the plates away that morning. Fresh braces gripped the stone in a circle around the bore point. The site lay quiet under our lamps. Silt drifted low over the floor. Steel support towers cast long bars across the rock. The bore head settled against the cap and locked in. I moved with the placement team, checking brace pins, coolant return, stress readings. The stone here felt wrong under my gloves, smooth in patches where the trench floor everywhere else ran rough and broken. Ancient tool marks showed through the sediment like healed cuts under skin. "Daniel," Rosalind said over comms, "your thermal strip." The heat profile on my wrist screen showed a climb below target depth, stronger than forecast. "Looks good." "Looks promising," she said. Marlon gave the all clear. The bore head spun up. Dust plumed from the cap, caught in the floodlights and spun away on the current. Meter by meter the drill drove down. A job like that folds a man into time. You stop counting minutes. You count feed rate, heat rise, motor load, stone density, seal integrity. Everything mattered. Everything spoke. At 4 meters the cap fought back. Hard layer. dense. The boar teeth screamed in a pitch that climbed through my helmet shell and settled behind my eyes. "Pressure spike on forward casing," Marlon said. "Compensate 3 points." He did. The load steadied. The drill bit again. At 6 meters, Rosalind's voice changed. "Daniel, I'm losing prediction. Heat pattern just dropped." "That's impossible! We're under the vent line." "I'm reading a void." Burns cut in from the surface relay. "Proceed." "Void means cavity," Rosalind snapped. "Proceed carefully." Heller came on a beat later. "Maintain operation. Chamber confirmation alone changes our options." I should have called stop right there. Instead, I looked at the numbers, at the rig, at the weak amber line of St. Anne far above, at the memory of Sam's tablet on our kitchen table, neat equations solving a system older men had nearly given up on. I thought of outer wards going black. Apprentice lists cut again and again until boys like him started believing the city had no future but maintenance and prayer. I wanted proof. I wanted enough heat to drag St. Anne 1 generation farther. I wanted, against all good sense, for one hard risk to mean something other than more loss. "Advance 2 meters," I said. "Sensor drop, then seal." Rosalind turned toward me so fast her lamp hit my chest. "Daniel!" But Burns had already confirmed. The drill punched through with a jolt that threw me off my boots. The borehead dropped half its length into open dark. My tether snapped tight across my chest. Floodlights swung down through stone dust. The chamber beneath us swallowed the beams. They crossed a wall that curved away on both sides like the inside of a buried cathedral. Stone figures covered it from floor to unseen height. Whole bodies, tall, narrow torsos, broad, finned shoulders, elongated skulls with mouths laid open in what could have been song or pain. They had fused into the rock ages ago. Some folded into themselves, some reached toward the dark below. All of them faced one direction, down. Nobody spoke for 3 seconds. In a dive suit, 3 seconds feels like prayer and shock at once. Rosalind found her voice first. "Those are bodies!" Ruth's warning came back to me with savage force. "Honor the marked depth." Marlon whispered, "Christ keep us." We sent a range ping. It came back weak and scattered, late enough to suggest the chamber bent sound into a shape our instruments no longer understood. "Chamber integrity?" Heller asked. I looked into that depth and did the worst kind of math, the kind a tired man does when he has already decided what answer he needs. "Stable enough for extension," I said. The drill advanced. When it bit again, black fluid rose through the return line. It carried its own light, thin at first, like dark oil braided with blue fire, then richer, thicker, running up the clear hose in luminous veins that curled around each other as if the fluid knew the shape of the pipe and liked it. "Shut it down," Rosalind said. I hit the kill. The borehead wound down. The fluid kept climbing. Return pressure should have dropped with the drill. It kept rising. Marlon grabbed the hose with both hands as if anger could stop a tide. "Valve stuck!" I moved in, worked the bypass lever and felt a sharp sting across the back of my glove where a seam had frayed on the casing bracket. A bead of the black fluid touched the split and spread cold through the fabric. Cold hit skin. The chamber fell away. I stood in a processional cut from stone, older than any human record. Bodies lined the walls in stacked ranks, fused through ribs and shoulders and open palms. Water moved through them in slow, glowing strands. Far below, something vast shifted, and everybody along the wall turned its empty face toward it. Then I was back at the bore site with Marlon in my ear. I tore my hand free. Black light clung to the damaged seam for a second, then vanished into the weave. "Daniel!" Rosalind seized my wrist and scanned the suit. "Exposure." "Minimal. Minimal still counts." I stared at the return hose. The black fluid moved upward toward the surface pumps. Above us, St. Anne waited with open intake channels, ready to swallow whatever we had drawn into its blood. We sealed the shaft in a scramble and rode the sleds back hard. Nobody said much. Every crewman kept glancing at his gloves, his seals, his own shadow moving through trench water. Decontamination turned ugly within the hour. Crewman Lewis Hayne started it. Quiet man from pump service. 2 daughters in lower glass. 3 nights earlier I had shared coffee with him while we rebuilt a regulator rack. He sat naked in the wash chair under ultraviolet lamps while medtechs passed probes over his skin. Then he raised his head and said very gently, "The gate sings through the pressure skin." Nobody moved. Hayne smiled at the far wall. Pilgrims laid their spines in the channels. Their mouths stayed open for the return. A tech touched his shoulder. Hayne drove 2 fingers into the woman's eye socket so hard his knuckles vanished. Men lunged for him. He bit through his own tongue. Blood and black fluid mixed at the corners of his mouth and ran down his chin in luminous threads. I had seen panic. I had seen decompression madness. What took Hayne sat in his body like devotion. Rosalind had me in isolation before the alarms finished changing bands. "It barely touched skin," I said. "That is enough." She put me in a glass-walled observation room under 3 banks of light. Monitors tracked skin temp, pupil response, blood chemistry, pressure tolerance. She stood outside with a slate and watched the figures rise and fall like a woman trying to decide which fact might still save something. "You saw something," she said through the speaker. "Yes. Tell me the shape." "Stone passage, bodies in the wall, something deep." "What kind of something?" "Big." "Daniel. You want a clean answer, I don't have one." She clicked the stylus against the slate. "The fluid carries a patterned response. Hayne had exposure through his visor vent. You had contact through damaged fabric. I need content." I shut my eyes and the chamber returned in knife-bright pieces. The ranks of fused bodies, the downward pull, the feeling that whatever lay below had known the drill before the drill knew it. When I spoke, I kept my voice level. It felt ceremonial, old, like I'd stepped into somebody else's prayer and it kept going after the worshippers died. That changed her face. Some hard inner calculation turned over. "The founder warnings," I said. "Warnings survive because details rot," Rosalind said. "That doesn't make them wrong." Ruth knew something. Ruth knows fragments wrapped in liturgy. Maybe the liturgy came from a reason. This time she didn't answer at once. She wrote. Power came back to 3 districts before dawn. That brought Heller his first wave of public support. Energy from the black fluid had hit the city's converters through the intake mix. Output rose 10% in under 2 hours. Heat returned to blocks that had spent days in cold. Families cheered outside med isolation. Somewhere in the same station wing, a woman cried out because Lewis Hayne had bitten through his own tongue and still would not stop trying to sing. Hayne died with his mouth open in a shape I had seen in the chamber. The pressure wave hit Ring 4 during second cycle. I was halfway out of med clearance, wrist banded and head still ringing, when the whole station lurched. A force moved through St. Anne as if the city had dropped an inch into some larger hand. Alarm bells kicked up across 3 bands. Red strips burst over the doors. Somewhere above, glass failed with a crack so broad it rolled through the city in layers. "Ring 4 breach," a dispatcher said over the net. "Full collapse! Full collapse!" I was already moving. The dive teams reached the ruined ring under floodlights and emergency strobes. Ring 4 had been a family habitat with a school annex and a view gallery where children pressed their palms to the glass and counted lanternfish. One whole side had folded inward. Fracture lines ran through the dome ribs. Tables, lunch trays, teaching slates, bodies, hydroplanters, all floated in the wreck water behind the broken shell. The dead had gathered at the viewing glass before it broke. Men, women, children, 20, maybe 30 in the first section I saw. All of them on their knees or folded forward with their hands against the pane. Faces tilted towards the dark beyond it. From inside the ruined ward, they looked like a congregation frozen in the same act. A child's learning slate drifted past my lamp. Flow pathways, secondary return. was still visible across the top in a careful school hand. Burns swam up beside me and turned his lamp away for a second. That alone told me the sight had reached him. "What did this?" I asked. "Pressure event." A civic phrase for something nobody knew how to name yet. Through the broken dome, past hanging frames and drifting school papers, deep water opened into black vastness. Our lamps caught movement there. Lanternfish in a ring, pale eels in smooth lines, crabs lifting from the wreck and settling again in a shared rhythm. Everything moved around a center point our lights could not frame. My suit speakers picked up a subsonic grind so low it felt like a thought under hearing. Rosalind came onto comms from the relay. "Daniel, what are you seeing?" "Life traffic, organized. By what?" I watched a slow swell move through the water beyond the dome. Small rubble turned toward it. Fish altered course around it with calm obedience. "A body," I said. "Too large for our lights." We recovered 6 bodies from the entry section before Burns pulled us back. Structural failure spread through the ring, and there were still people inside, still children. But another swell moved through the wreck water, and the whole frame started to come apart from the base up. Men do ugly math under pressure. How many can be saved? How many bodies slow the rest? How long before the city claims another crew? Back in St. Anne, a crowd had already formed outside Civic Hall. People wanted names for the dead. People wanted the restored heat to keep flowing. People wanted someone to say the breach came from age, stress, anything that still fit inside a world of valves and pressure locks. Heller stood before the cameras within the hour. "A tragic structural loss," he said. "Unconnected at present to the thermal breakthrough. We have no verified evidence of systemic breach below foundation. We do have verified evidence that restored output is preventing wider collapse." That was the clever version of separate, not denial. Reprioritization. I stood in the back of the hall with salt drying on my neck from soot seep and felt rage settle into something steadier. Rosalind found me after the address. "There's more?" "You mean aside from the kneeling dead?" "The fluid." She spoke too evenly, which meant she was close to breaking. "It produces coherent activity in neural tissue samples. The response repeats across species." "You say that like you're impressed." "I'm frightened," she said, "and curious, which is almost worse. Shut the intake channels." Heller refused. I stared at her. She held my gaze. "He says if he shuts them now, whole ward trees freeze before next cycle." He is not entirely wrong. That was the first moment I truly hated how much sense he could still make. "Where's Ruth?" I asked. "In the archive chapel." St. Anne's oldest chapel sat low in the central spine where founder stone met the first alloy shell. The place felt older than the rest of the station because part of it truly was. The founders had cut prayer alcoves into the trench wall and built their first pressure rooms around them. Time had polished the stone with hands, grief, and repetition. Lamps burned in shielded cups along the nave. Water dripped somewhere behind the wall and came through the quiet like a second clock. Sister Ruth waited at a long table covered in resin-sealed sheets, slate fragments, and pressure maps. She looked like she had slept in that chair for a year. "You warned us," I said. She studied my face. "You opened the marked depth." "Yes." "You had reasons. You know what's down there." Her fingers moved over a resin sheet where founder script ran in cramped lines. "I know pieces. Pieces survive. Explanations don't. Drop the sermon. This is the opposite of sermon." She slid the sheet towards me. Under the prayer marks sat a crude schematic. Foundation depth. Seal line. Avoid breach below threshold. Pressure organ present within lower cavity. Never ring the deep. I looked from the diagram to her. This was engineering. It began that way. The first survivors built St. Anne over older stone cut by something else. They found cavities below the trench floor, bodies in the walls. Survey teams that came back altered, or did not come back at all. They recorded pressure events, changes in conduct. Then their numbers shrank, literacy narrowed, memory thinned, warning language changed shape. Demonology survives longer in a frightened population than procedures do. I thought of my father's death report without wanting to. Foundation subsidence, service collapse, loss during restricted excavation. I had been 16 when I carried his tool bag home. You knew all these years. My order knew enough to fear the lower seam, not enough to understand it. And yes, she said before I could accuse her, we let fear stand in for clarity, because fear was easier to preserve. Rosalind arrived, sample canisters clipped to her belt. I ran more tests. Ruth gave her a guarded nod. Rosalind set one canister on the table. Black light swam within. The fluid transmits pattern stimulation through nerve tissue. Vision centers react first, then compulsion. Exposure scales with contact. It doesn't just poison, it roots. Roots toward what? I asked. Ruth answered before Rosalind could. Opening systems. Rosalind glanced at the founder sheets, then back at me. That fits what we're seeing. 3 intake techs disabled their own locks this afternoon. 2 med orderlies tried to divert contaminated rinse water into the main circulation line. They all described the same vision content before restraint. What vision? Rosalind met my eyes. Descent, procession, joy, a great body below them. I felt the black touch at my wrist again. Ruth drew out a thicker sheet wrapped in oilskin. The founders prepared for breach. Charges in the side seam. Collapse inward. Glass the cavity mouth before full pressure transfer. I studied the map. That puts a team within 10 yards of the opening. Yes, we can do it. Ruth's gaze stayed on the page. Then do it before Civic Hall decides hunger is worth obedience. We didn't move fast enough. At the lower launch, Burns waited with 4 security men and a sealed order from Civic Hall. Foundation zone under civic control, he said. Director authority. I read the order. Controlled extraction. Restricted research access. Lower intake priority. Heller had made his choice. Not because he thought nothing was wrong, because he thought he could use the wrong thing before it used him. Heller saw Ring 4, I said. He saw the reserve numbers too, Burns answered. So did I. You want outer wards frozen by dawn? I want the city to stop drinking poison. He set a hand on the charge crate by my boot. Director wants 1 controlled sample run, then a seal assessment. Rosalind stepped forward. Every exposure increases patterned response. You are not controlling this. Maybe not, Burns said, but I can control panic. That finally sounded like him. Ruth moved closer, voice quiet enough to cut. Control is just fear in a better coat. Burns looked at her the way hard men look at clergy when they're too tired to be respectful. Sister, I don't speak chapel. You're about to. I took 1 step toward the sled cradle. Burns moved to meet me. My fist landed before either of us could dress the moment in rules. His head snapped sideways. One of his men reached for my arm, and Marlon hit him from behind with a wrench hard enough to settle the matter. Rosalind went for the dock controls. Ruth started handing out release tags from a chapel keyring she had no lawful business carrying. We launched under emergency dark with 1 sled, 1 charge crate, Rosalind's case, Ruth's maps, Marlon on rear tether, and the full knowledge that if we failed, St. Anne might lose more than law before morning. The trench floor seemed to wait for us. Maybe that was the exposure talking. Maybe it was simple dread. Either way, the descent shaft stood in our lamps. The seal plates from our first mission had already warped outward along their bolts. Black fluid threaded through the seams in slow, bright beads. We cut through and went down. The chamber showed more of itself this time. Our lamps reached a wide stone apron around the bore mouth, then dropped into the great hollow beneath. The wall of fused pilgrims curved away on both sides in ranks so vast the mind rejected the scale before the eye did. Bodies had been laid into channels with intention. Their spines fed carved grooves. Their open mouths pointed toward troughs in the stone. Ritual and plumbing shared the same design. They built worship into fluid control, Ruth said. Rosalind swept a sensor wand over one of the channels. Residue still active. Set charges, I said. We moved fast. Marlon took the left seam. I took the right. Rosalind mapped stress bands. Ruth called distance from founder notes. For 6 minutes work held fear at bay. Charge seated, brace locked, cable run, timer synced. Then my lamp crossed the wall beneath the bore apron and found the bell. The structure rose from the chamber face like an organ grown from stone and calcified hide. A concave membrane, cracked with age, stretched across a ring wider than a transport cab. Grooves ran from it down into the deeper dark. Our drill had sliced one edge. Fresh breaks gleamed pale around the wound. We hit that, I said. Ruth turned her lamp and drew in air through her teeth. Founder term was tongue of summons. Rosalind passed her wand over the membrane. It squealed. Residual resonance is climbing. We should have left then. Instead, Burns came down the shaft on a powered frame with 2 surviving security men and a canister rack bolted to the rig. Heller had dropped the polite language. He had sent a raid. Burns landed hard on the apron and brought his weapon up. Stand down. You fire in here, I said. We all die. Heller wants one clean extraction. Heller wants to feed the thing. He wants heat. That was the last sentence in the chamber. Lewis Hayne walked out of the black below. He should have been in Morgue Seal 3 levels up. I had watched med crews close the bag. Water moved around him with slow grace. His suit hung half open at the chest. Skin along his jaw and throat carried black light in branching lines. He rose from the deeper dark and set both feet on the lower stones as if he had been invited back to his own pew. One of Burns's men jerked his lamp down. Hayne lifted his face. His eyes held the chamber glow. The gate remembers the strike, he said. Burns fired. The round broke Hayne's shoulder apart. Black fluid burst from the wound in a spray of cold stars. Hayne took one more step and drove both hands into the charge rig at Marlon's feet. The detonator pack shattered. Cable lines snapped free. The blast cap spun away into the dark. The bell membrane flexed inward. Pressure hit the chamber in one vast stroke. My helmet alarm screamed. Lamps burst along the apron. Burns's nearest man folded under the force, suit shell crushing against his ribs until the visor cracked white. Marlon went off his feet and slid toward the drop. Rosalind struck the wall so hard her comm cut out in static. The water itself bent around something rising below. I caught a glimpse through all that ruin. A moving surface larger than any structure in St. Anne, passing through the dark with the slow authority of weather. Hide ridged in layers like old fortress walls, embedded along one flank, relic shapes pressed into healing flesh. A line of eye structures opening one after another with wet inner light. It was looking at the city. Ruth shouted a founder prayer that turned into coordinates halfway through. I lunged for Marlon, caught his tether and slammed my boots into the stone lip. Burns vanished from my right. One of his men went with him, sucked over the apron as the pressure flow reversed towards the abyss. Rosalind came back on comm in broken fragments. Right seam. Gone. Daniel. I hauled Marlon up. His left leg bent wrong below the knee. Burns clung to a brace post with one hand and his weapon with the other. He looked across the chamber once, saw enough of the shape below, and all command left his face. Up, I said. Up now. Ruth got Rosalind under one arm. I dragged Marlon. Burns followed because terror had finally done what argument could not. Behind us the bell chamber gave out a deep rolling note that came through my bones more than my ears. Somewhere beneath that note, something vast turned in satisfaction. Crisis changes a city's manners before it changes its maps. 2 days later, St. Anne had armed checkpoints at every pressure junction, prayer circles in the food lines, and sabotage in half the lower systems. The black fluid had spread in diluted traces through the intake grid. Rosalind confirmed that with horror in her eyes and numbers in her hand. Exposure was strongest in maintenance crews, med staff, and anyone assigned near lower flow control, though panic ran wider than contamination. People saw processions in condensation on corridor glass. Men woke sleepwalking towards sealed bulkheads. Women knelt by drain grates and listened for hymns in the water. Work crews failed at the worst moments. One team opened a flood bypass in nursery spine and drowned the hydro routes. 2 valve techs locked themselves in a service alcove with black fluid drawn from a sampling port and let it run across their tongues. Hella imposed curfew and called it stability. Ruth went public in the oldest way she knew. She entered the central chapel during ration assembly and read the founder warnings in plain language before the altar cameras. She spoke of sealed depth, pressure organs, conduct alteration, and the command never to ring the deep. Half the city called her brave, half called her faithless. All of St. Anne learned within an hour that its religion had hidden an engineering manual for 500 years. I spent that same hour hunting for Sam. His school block had evacuated after 3 students tried to pry open a service gate below the hydro wing. One instructor told me he had seen Sam heading toward lower distribution with a crowd of boys from the outer wards. My son had always moved toward the place where anger collected fastest. I found them in Intake Gallery 6. The gallery overlooked one of the major lower pipes through a shielded pane so maintenance crews could inspect flow. A cracked service valve at the base of the glass had sprayed a thread of black-lit water across the floor. 10 residents knelt around it in a rough ring. Some mouthed prayers, some cried. One old woman rocked as if listening to a cradle song. Sam stood among them with one hand on the manual override wheel for the intake gate. For one brutal second, I saw him as the dead in Ring 4 had looked at the glass. His body was still his own, but something had leaned into him and found the shape of worship there. "Sam," I said over the gallery speaker. He turned. His face was still my son's. His eyes carried the same inner shine I had seen in Hain. "Dad," he said, and his voice held 2 cadences at once, one his own and one deep enough to seem spoken through stone. "It wants passage." I hit the emergency hatch and forced my way inside before security could lock the gallery down. Every person in that ring turned toward me together. The old woman smiled. "The roof shakes, the buried court rises." Sam tightened his grip on the wheel. One more turn and the intake gate would crack open, pulling unfiltered trench water into the lower grid. I stepped forward. "Let go. You said work changes things. It does. It showed me the city from below. All our walls sit on its gate. All our prayers were keys." I kept moving, hands open, the way you approach a frightened child near a shaft. "You're hearing the fluid." "I'm hearing truth." The boys beside him shifted to block me. One of them was Owen Kress, son of my closest friend in pump service. I had watched that boy learn to solder with hands too big for the tools. "Move," I told Owen. He spread his arms. "St. Anne starved because old men feared the deep. St. Anne survived because old men feared the right things." He lunged. I shoved him aside harder than I meant to. His temples struck the handrail with a wet sound that still comes back to me in sleep. He dropped and did not rise. The rest broke at once. Someone cried out. Someone clawed at my coat. Sam spun the wheel half a turn. Water roared against the intake shield with new force. I drove into him, got both hands on the override arm and slammed it back against the lock. He fought like a grown man under full panic. For 1 second I felt the deep thing working through his muscles, aiming him at the gate. Then his footing slipped in the black water, and I got the lock pin through. Security teams flooded in. Burns would have had them shoot first. Burns had not returned to command since the chamber below. The new commander used restraint foam and blunt staves. The gallery went white with chemical webbing and shouted prayer. I dropped to my knees beside Owen and pressed my hand to his throat. Nothing. One dead boy because I got there too late to prevent the moment and early enough to make myself part of it. They took Sam to med isolation. I stood at the decon sink afterward, washing Owen's blood and black water off my hands, and watched my own face in the steel until Ruth found me. "There is one more seal," she said. I turned. She held a founder key plate wrapped in cloth. The chamber charges were an outer measure. The founders built a second system under St. Anne itself, a last seal tied to the reserve banks. "How last?" Her gaze stayed on mine. "It closes the seam from our side. It also burns out large sections of the city grid. Whole wards may die with it." I thought of Sam under isolation lights, of nursery glass, of lower blocks, of Owen Cress by the rail, and Hella somewhere in Civic Hall still counting gained output against the dead. "Show me." The route to the founder vault ran beneath the chapel through a locked stair older than the current city maps. Rosalind joined us at the first pressure door with a case of notes, 3 ampules of suppressants, and the look of a woman who had gone past exhaustion into purpose. "What about Sam?" I asked. "He's stable," she said. "He responds to your name and memory prompts. Exposure remains active. He stays in med. He comes with us." "No." "Yes." Her answer snapped like a cable under strain. "The fluid established pattern access through him that none of us have. He can hear signal shifts in contaminated water before instruments catch them. He's 17. And already inside the system whether we like it or not." Ruth laid a hand on my arm. "He may be the one thread that keeps you from the wrong turn below." I wanted to refuse. I wanted to drag my son to the highest dry place in St. Anne and sit there with him until the city made its own choice. The city had already made it. I had helped. Sam came down from med with a sedative patch at his neck, wrists loose in front restraints, 2 orderlies at his sides. He looked pale and ashamed and very young. That nearly broke me. "You should have left me there," he said when they released him at the vault door. "You're with me," I said. His eyes moved to the founder key plate in Ruth's hand. "It's below this." "How do you know?" "I can feel where the pressure changes." No one spoke for a moment. The founder vault opened into a chamber cut directly into the trench stone beneath St. Anne's central spine. Bronze prayer plates lined the entry arch. Beyond them stood the engine the founders had hidden inside their religion. Banks of old valves rose in 2 facing rows, each fitted with hand wheels and locking teeth worn smooth by generations of upkeep. Carved into the stone above them ran liturgical text I had heard all my life in chapel. Petitions for mercy, restraint, shelter from the deep. Ruth translated as she walked. "Open reserve, brace the roof, seal the throat, cut the path." At the centre stood a control dais, facing a round shaft that fell straight down into black. Thick conduit trunks ran from the dais into the walls and upward through St. Anne's core. This was where the city's first thermal banks met the older seal, where prayer had become operating language, because the founders feared ordinary memory would fail. Rosalind set her case on the dais and connected her instruments to the old ports. "The reserve hardware still answers." "Of course it does," Ruth said. "Our people kept praying maintenance for 5 centuries. Sam stood near the shaft with his eyes shut. "Something's moving." Hella arrived then with 4 security men and a resonator sled built from parts stripped out of the first drill telemetry rack. Ugly, hurried, functional, dangerous. He looked older now. The city had eaten through his polish, but his eyes were still clear. "Step away from the controls," he said. "Nobody is giving you that engine," I told him. He glanced at the shaft, the carvings, Ruth. "You hid this from civic record." "We hid it from ambitious men," Ruth said. Rosalind stepped between Hella and the dais. "Grant, listen to me. The fluid uses perception as route mapping. Every exposure, every vision, every act of surrender gives it a path into St. Anne." He looked at her and spoke without performance. "I know what it's doing," he said. "I also know outer spine lost heat 6 hours ago. I know 2 nursery blocks are sharing 1 warm ward. I know if we trip that seal and lose reserve routing, people who are not contaminated die freezing in the dark. Do not speak to me as if I'm blind to cost." That almost made him more dangerous. You still think it's a power source, I said. I think it is power, he answered. The question is whether we master it before it masters us. Sam staggered and pressed both hands to his ears. I moved toward him. One of Hella's men blocked me. I slammed him into a valve bank and heard bone crack. Another swung a baton. I stepped low, drove my shoulder, shoved him into his own partner. The vault erupted in close violence. Hella hit the resonator switch. The sound that came out of the rig had no business inside a human building. It rolled down the shaft and up the conduit trunks, carrying the shape of the bell we had wounded below. Every valve in the chamber rattled. Rosalind's instruments died in a burst of sparks. 2 security men dropped at once with blood running from their ears. Water surged up the central shaft. Hella met death in the founder vault. The pressure strike took him across the chest before he could cut the rig. His body hit the far wall and stayed there for one impossible beat with his knees bent under him, head tipped toward the carvings like a penitent at an altar. Then he slid down and left a red fan across the stone. The vault lights died. Emergency strips came on in hard red along the floor. Manual stations, Ruth said. She moved through the dark with the speed of a woman stepping into the task she had been trained for all her life. Her hands found the valve wheels. She called the liturgy in plain sequence now, no ornament left. Reserve open. Brace line 1. Cut channel 4. Daniel, to the dais. Rosalind crawled back to the controls with blood on one temple and began forcing the reserve feed by hand. The remaining security men fled or dropped where they stood, broken by pressure and panic. Sam crouched by the shaft with tears on his face. It's under us. It knows. I know. Ruth turned the last primary wheel, and the skin along her forearm split under the strain. Black water burst from a side gasket and washed over her sleeves. She kept turning. Ruth. I moved toward her. Stay where your task stands, she said through gritted teeth. This line needs blood and muscle. Mine still counts. Rosalind read the gauge plate by emergency lamp. Reserve flow engaged, seal track armed, remote trigger gone. I stared at the dais, the shaft, the founder schematic fixed under cracked resin. The final path was clear enough even to my tired brain. Manual closure from below. Rosalind met my eyes. Yes. Distance. Downshaft maintenance sled. Ride it to the breech throat. Trip the closure lever at source. The vault shuddered again. Somewhere above us, a whole section of St. Anne lost power and went black. Sam got to his feet. I can guide you. You stay here. He stepped toward me, face white in the red light. It keeps pushing false turns into my head. I can feel where they are. I can keep you off them. No. He grabbed my coat. Dad, listen to me for once as if I know something. That hurt because it was true. I pressed my forehead to his for 1 second, enough to remember the weight of him as a child when I carried him asleep from chapel through corridors that had once still been warm. All right, I said. You stay on comm. You keep talking. Ruth got the maintenance sled loose from its cradle below the dais, while Rosalind forced the reserve line higher. Steam burst from old trunk seals and rolled across the chamber in white sheets. The stone underfoot grew hot. Ruth's skin had gone grey. Black light threaded up her sleeves from the burst gasket. She locked the last valve in place with both hands and looked at me with a calm I did not deserve. The founders were weak in body by the end, she said, so they made memory holy. Keep the words plain when you pass them on. You're coming with us. My task stands here. I knew then she would die at that bank with both hands on the city's last prayer. I got onto the sled. Rosalind clipped my harness, shoved an emergency ampule into my kit, and pressed the trigger key into my palm. If the visions climb too high, inject this through the neck port. Will it help? It might make you slower. It might keep your mind your own. She gripped my shoulder. Close the seam. Whatever you see, close it. Sam crouched at the shaft edge, headset line patched into my comm. His voice came low and quick. I can hear the channels. Left branch sings higher. Right branch drops into open water. Take left at the split. Keep saying useful things. The sled released. I dropped through the heart of St. Anne on a ribbon of founder iron, while reserve heat roared through the conduit trunks around me. Stone walls flashed past in red light and black gaps. Every 100 feet the shaft widened into service collars lined with old prayers and newer repairs. The whole city seemed built around this hidden throat, a chimney for fear and duty both. Pressure changed as I descended. My ears clicked inside the helmet. Water seeped through cracks in warm threads that flashed black under the emergency lights. Then the shaft opened and the sled shot into lower maintenance tunnels cut along the foundation seam. "Left," Sam said in my ear. "Sharp left. Keep moving." The tunnels carried founder marks on every wall, direction arrows laid beneath scripture, hazard signs dressed as devotional symbols. Generations had walked here, keeping systems they were trained to fear. I passed 2 bodies in Station Grey at the first junction, both maintenance men from recent emergency crews. Each had turned toward a side niche and knelt there until the water took him. "Eyes on the rail," Sam said. A voice rose from the left branch ahead, soft as chapel service. My mother's voice. She had died when I was 12. She called my childhood name the way she used to when soup was hot and evening work was done. I kept my eyes on the rail. The tunnel widened toward the breech throat. Black fluid ran through carved channels in the floor, lit from within. Beyond it, the stone opened into the abyssal chamber we had seen from above, only now I approached from the side, by the old sacrificial route itself. The pilgrims filled the walls. Up close, the bodies showed toolwork around them, grooves cut to receive spines, shoulders, skull ridges. Their faces had worn under the ages and still held an expression I could only call willingness. Some civilization before ours had built reverence out of labor and anatomy together. They had turned their dead into valves. The Leviathan moved below. This time I saw more because I stood where the founders had meant a man to stand if the last seal ever failed. The thing rose through the lower dark in a curve of hide and scars broad as city walls. Water peeled away from its mass in silver lines. Embedded relic matter ran along its flank. Bones, worked stone, metal from other ages. Perhaps whole offerings pressed into healing flesh across centuries. Several eye structures opened along a ridge and stared upward with recognition. It knew me. That feeling came immediate. I was the man who had rung the bell. "Daniel," Sam said, voice sharp now. "The closure lever sits under the bell route, 40 feet ahead." I forced the sled off the track at the service lip and went the rest on foot, mag boots biting old stone, reserve cable dragging from my harness. Heat built through the sheath. The final trigger key burned in my glove. Voices rose from the pilgrim's wall as I passed. My father telling me he had found a better tunnel below the marked line. Owen Cress asking why I shoved him so hard. Hella promising light for the city. Haynes singing in that calm. I reached the bell route. Up close the structure showed our drill wound and older scars around it, marks from strikes long before human arrival. The closure lever sat inside a stone housing wrapped in founder script. One pull would send full reserve through the seam braces and vitrify the breech mouth. The loss projections flashed on my wrist. Outer docks, upper spine, our home block, escape lines. Half the city's easy future. Sam's breathing came through the comm. "Dad, you seeing the board?" "Yes." He knew what it meant. Smart enough, old enough. Hurt enough. "If I pull this," I said, "our block goes dark for years, maybe forever." Silence, then, "Do it." The deeper voice under his own tried to speak through him. I heard it catch in his throat like current through a damaged wire. "Sam, I'm here. Tell me about your systems exam." A broken laugh came through the line. "What? Tell me." I placed top in flow diagnostics. "What problem gave the rest trouble?" "Thermal lag through a damaged exchanger tree." "What did you answer?" His breathing steadied as memory took hold. Reroute through the secondary jacket. Bleed trapped steam through service line 2. That's my boy. Below me, the Leviathan turned. One great eye opened wider. Pressure built in the chamber. The pilgrims seemed to lean, though I knew the stone itself did not move. I drove the key into the slot and pulled the closure lever with both hands. Reserve heat came through the cable in one savage rush. Light burst down every carved channel in the chamber floor. White spread through the black fluid and outshone it. Stone at the seam mouth cracked, sagged, and flowed like glass under a furnace. The bell root split. A note of such depth rolled through the chamber that blood ran warm down my neck inside the suit. The Leviathan surged. Its body struck upward through the lower dark with enough force to tear whole slabs from the pilgrim's wall. Water became impact. My boots ripped free. I slammed against the closure housing and felt something tear along my side. "Daniel!" Rosalind came over comm, thin through static. "Keep reserve on," I said. The seam began to close. Glass bloomed across the breach in sheets, crawling over stone and channels alike. Black fluid flashed white wherever the heat caught it. The Leviathan rammed the narrowing throat once, twice. Each strike sent another district death notice across my wrist gauge. Outer dock, upper spine, block 9 north. Home. I kept the lever down. The third strike came weaker. The thing fell back into the abyss with a slow convulsion that shook relic matter free from its hide. A carved stone head spun past my lamp. Behind it rolled one final view of that massive flank, and the eye structures closing one after another as the seal hardened between us. Then the breech mouth fused shut. Silence arrived in pieces. First the pressure note stopped, then the water calmed. Then my comm returned with Rosalind saying my name through static and Sam trying to answer over her. I do not remember the climb back well. Pain took most of it. Heat took the rest. I know I found the service rail. I know I crawled more than walked. I know the founder tunnels shook around me as sealed wards died, and St. Anne learned survival through amputation. When I woke, I was in med under low light with my right side bound from hip to ribs and my wrists strapped to the bed rails. Rosalind sat beside me with a stack of slates on her lap. She looked older by a decade. "You tried to get up twice," she said. "How long?" 3 days. "St. Anne." She took a breath before answering. "Alive." That word cost her something. "Ruth?" Rosalind lowered her eyes. She kept the reserve valves open until the closure registered. We found her at the bank with both hands locked on the wheel. I shut my eyes. "Sam." "He's here." He came in a minute later, thinner than before, face drawn, a white patch over the inside of one wrist where Med had burned out a contamination line. He stood by the bed as if he feared I might vanish if he leaned too close. "How bad?" I asked. He understood the question. "Upper dock's gone. 4 home blocks sealed. Ring 4 and Ring 5 lost. Hydro at half output. Central Chapel is a shelter ward now. They moved us to maintenance housing near Foundation Watch." Us. The word landed gently. "You all right?" He thought about it instead of lying. "I still hear pressure changes before alarms catch them. Rosalind says it may stay." "So you're useful." He almost smiled. Weeks passed. St. Anne shrank around its wounds and kept going because there was nothing else for it to do. That is the truth of any city built by desperate people. Survival becomes tradition faster than grief ever gets its proper time. Rosalind released the founder records to public archive in full. No more disguise. People could read the old warnings plain now. Chapel services changed after that. The liturgy carried valve sequences and depth limits without cover. Children learned them in school beside flow math and pressure discipline. Faith remained. It just put on sterner clothes. Hella's portrait came down from Civic Hall. Nobody argued for keeping it. My block stayed under seal. Sam and I moved to Foundation watch quarters cut into the lower spine near the old vault. The city needed people at the scar now. People who knew the sound of the sealed roof and could tell panic from a true pressure shift. Rosalind argued for sensors and automated review. I agreed and still took the watch myself. Sam got his apprentice placement after all. Reserve exchanges. He comes back with hot metal dust on his sleeves and questions sharp enough to keep me honest. Every few nights he sits with me by the reinforced glass over the founder shaft, while the reduced lungs of St. Anne breathe through the dark. Pumps cycle. Far wards complain through old pipes. Children run in shelter corridors where chapel pews used to stand. Under all that, far below the fused seam, pressure still moves from time to time. I feel it before the gauges do. The contamination never fully left me. Rosalind calls it residual pattern sensitivity. Ruth would have called it mark. I do not care which language takes it. The meaning stays the same. I opened the way. I closed it. Part of me remains tuned to the door. When the pressure changes come, I write them down in plain words: date, depth, duration, clear warnings, accurate terms. No room left for men like me to mistake danger for superstition because hunger makes us arrogant. Sometimes Sam asks what the chamber looked like. I tell him the truth each time: stone, bodies, channels, a living court beneath our feet. I tell him fear has its uses when it points to a real wall and says, keep this sealed. I tell him cities die from lies dressed as courage almost as often as they die from cold. He listens. He learns. For now, that is enough. St. Anne's survived. Sealed wards full of the dead. Outer domes gone. Families stacked in shelter beds. Heat on strict ration. Founder prayers recited as maintenance law by children who know exactly why the words matter. Survival came with a bill, and we paid it in stone, blood, and truth. I end most watches the same way. Hand on the rail, eyes on the reinforced glass, listening to the water move through the city we saved by making it smaller. Far below, something ancient passes under the sealed roof once in a long while. It does not knock. It remembers.